Your code coverage report is lying to you. I'm sorry. I really am. About me, I've got just about a year with Angular. I've been doing quality assurance, product testing, independent verification and validation, software, hardware, for about 15 years or so. This is my puppy, Libby. She's my stand-in for my picture because you can see my face. So I figure I'll give you something else to look at. I've got over 20 years playing with Legos. Hopefully that impresses at least one of you. I know all the lyrics to Weird Al's Episode 1, which was better than the movie. And if you need to, I can program your VCR. So that's my nerd cred. So we're here to talk about the conspiracy against your code coverage. And to do that, I have a very small app here. We'll see if we can get this guy running. So this is my little Angular app. I built it with the Angular 7 CLI. I can log in without having a username or password, which is pretty cool. So this is my conspiracy log. This lets me log my conspiracies. So if I have a new conspiracy, but maybe my title is too short, right? I have minimum character validations. I can add multiple conspirators. I can log something interesting about it, and then I can add it to my list. If I want to, I can edit one of these. Oh, well, that didn't edit, that did something else. Well, maybe if I hit the delete button, I can instead edit. If I refresh and go back to the main page, similarly, I have minimum character length restrictions. I have field required validations, but it doesn't matter. So the functionality here is ultimately meaningless. What I want to show you is that this little app does quite a bit, right? It's got some reactive forms, it's got some validations, it has dynamic error messaging, it maintains a list. There are 2 services running inside. There's a lot going on here, right? Great little demo app. So who thinks that's pretty good code coverage? That's 88% on the line coverage. I know my client contract says 85%.
Can you make the font bigger?
Sure. Is that better? So that's achieved by running 6 tests. Let me see if I can make this larger. Can we see that? 6 tests. I'll try one more layer here. There you go.
You also may want to switch to light theme.
Where am I going to find that in VS Code?
Control P. Control P. Search. Type a right bracket, like a greater than sign, and then theme. And then just do like light plus up at the top. Yeah, there you go. There.
Is that better?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Let me trash my terminals and get them up and running again. So the terminal on the left is running the application. The terminal on the right is running my code coverage reports with watch turned on true. So it's going to rerun code coverage every time I change anything in the application. And as we'll see here, we've got Karma booting up. And we get our 6 tests. So as I mentioned, this application was built using the Angular CLI. So you'll notice a pattern here, a lot of should create, and not a lot of else. right? These are the default tests that Angular ships with a new component or service whenever it makes something. And we can look at these tests by checking out the code in the spec files. Should create, expect component to be truthy. We've all seen this before, right? This is pretty standard stuff. Cool. All right. So going back here, we've got our code coverage report, which is pretty good. Some of these components are at 100% coverage from a should create. So a lot more going on than just creating a component, right? OK, so the who of our conspiracy, Angular, Jasmine, and Karma Istanbul. So what we have going on here is Angular's testbed. This is our test scaffolding. This is spooling up our component, connecting the HTML template into the TypeScript component. It's wiring up inputs and outputs, running our lifecycle hooks, ng on init, ng on changes, on destroy, et cetera. It's doing a whole lot of work for us. We have the Jasmine testing framework and Karma, which is our test runner, and Karma Istanbul, which does the coverage report. This all ships from the Angular CLI, all stock standard stuff. So the Angular testbed is one of our players here. It's an emulator, right? It emulates the Angular engine, does a whole bunch of things, hooks a whole bunch of things up. When you call fixture.detect changes, it runs the lifecycle creation process, runs change detection. But third point over there, it's not necessary. It's not necessary for unit tests, right? Our classes are JavaScript classes. Our functions are JavaScript functions. By and large, you're never going to find code coverage for anything in HTML anyway. So why bother? We'll get to that. Jasmine, they bill it as behavior-driven JavaScript. It only cares about the JavaScript. So it's more versatile than you might think. Interesting to note about Jasmine, if you don't already know this, but tests pass by default. They don't fail until one of those expects that you write fails. So if you don't write any expects, all of your tests pass, which is a pretty slick trick. And then lastly, Jasmine has full support for JavaScript in those files. So you can loop tests, you can do branches, you can do nested loops if you have a set of conditions and a set of alternate conditions and you're testing something like a sort or something else. You can just loop your tests, which is pretty cool. And then lastly, Karma Istanbul. This is the runner, compiles our different test files, calls Jasmine, spools all that up, writes all those console log outputs. The Istanbul portion does our code coverage. It gets reports from Jasmine as to what lines are being run, builds our pretty HTML reports like we were looking at. But the problem here is that Karma Istanbul is blind, right? It assumes that lines executed means the line was tested, which is ultimately not true, as we've been seeing. Should create doesn't test any of the lines inside my constructor. It doesn't test any properties in my class, right? I'm not asserting anything about those. So the problem here, as we're getting into, is that we have some bad defaults. The Angular CLI automatically writes tests using the testbed, right? It sets you on a path, and the average developer takes that path and goes, not knowing what hidden road bumps there might be. Secondly, the Angular testbed has a whole bunch of automatic calls it does under the hood. As soon as you call fixture detect changes, it's running 3 or 4 different lifecycle hooks, which you may have functions in. As soon as those lifecycle hooks get run, those functions get run, all of those are lines that get executed. Therefore, they are lines that are covered by a should create test. All due to our blind accountant, Karma Istanbul, which all it knows to do is count the beans. It doesn't know any better. It's not its fault. So the problem looking at code. Here is the code for the home component. I apologize for the small text. On the left, we have the component itself. We have some properties. Use my fancy laser pointer. We have some properties here. We have some spool up in our constructor. We're doing things like watching about whether or not we've logged in, because this guy switches between my login component and my 2 add and list components. It has a subject for edit conspiracy. When I click that button on the list, it's going to launch the conspiracy over to the form, so I can edit that. And that all gets stood up here in the constructor, right? So this is the code that Angular ships at the very beginning of the component, modified by pulling in my forms modules and my authentication service. So these 2 lines here, imports and providers, are the only 2 that I've actually modified in this test, just so it would compile. So our expect component to be truthy really only exercises these 2 lines. hey, a class exists and it has a constructor. Yet we see all of these ones right here, and this class has 100% coverage. But we have not asserted anything about any of these other 6 lines of code in our test. For shame. This is not helpful. So what do we do about this? What's our fix? Because there is a fix, I promise. I'm not up here to just complain about these things. I have a solution for you. And it has some pretty cool side effects too. So first of all, let's drop the test bed. For unit tests, integration, keep them. It automatically wires up your components together. It automatically brings in your services. It's fantastic for integration tests. But if you're only working on one component or one service, one class, just get rid of it. It's not doing any favor. We're not here to test whether or not Angular can wire up a component to itself. If that's broken, we got bigger problems, right? So let's just not worry about it. It's overkill for anything above, or sorry, at the unit test level or lower. So what does that mean? That means we're going to redraw the boundary of what unit test means. Unit test means anything inside one class. Instead of thinking about unit as a component, does this component manage its HTML wirings correctly? We're going to reduce that scope just a little bit to only the TypeScript. Because ultimately, that's where our logic should live in the first place. You can't easily test logic that's living in the HTML. If you have logical expressions in the HTML, that's stuff that you can't test very easily. You have to go through a debug element. You have to enact JavaScript changes. It's wordy. It's verbose. It's a pain. All of those should be functions in your TypeScript. You can test them there. And then in your integration tests, you could test 1 or 2 of them. Does it actually call this function? Does it not? Right? There's no code coverage for HTML. It's another good reason to not put your logic there. But anything that uses multiple components, or anything that works on wiring between TypeScript and HTML should be an integration test, and that can totally use the test bed. Nothing wrong with that. As far as other concerns, when we need to use mocks, mock services, things like that, I mean, there's no reason we can't use those at the unit level. They're mocks, they're fakes, they're part of the test scaffolding, they're part of the test structure, so they're not really our concern. So then our test goes from what we had before, which is, I don't know, 15, 20 lines, to something notably smaller. And it's pure JavaScript, right? We have our component, just like over here. That didn't change. All of this can go away and simply be replaced with a constructor call by calling it manually. We can call our own form builder. That's normally dependency injected, but you can just call new form builder, no problem. And then any services that you dependency inject get pulled in by simply calling the service. This could be a mock right here. This could be mock authentication service that extends authentication service. That will compile just fine. Now my should create accurately tests those 2 lines of code that I actually care about. And now I don't have to bother with maintaining this mess when I get large components that have a lot of children. I don't have to bother with losing out on providers that I forgot to bring in because they usually get provided at a deeper, higher level in the tree. If you use custom pipes, this gets really confusing because you have to either declare or import them, and then you have to add them to your providers list. This becomes a pain to try to figure out. Because normally, Angular does all of it for you. But here, you have to do it manually. So why not do it manually? So in order to do this, attack your code. Rework your unit tests all at once, or maybe as you need to. My team did it in about a sprint, near the end of the sprint, when developers got done with their stories. We had one guy who coordinated across all of our components. He made sure no 2 people were working on the same component. Each person took a component, stripped out the test bed for what we could, left the test bed in for what we needed to, separated them into 2 files, integration.spec.ts and spec.ts. And that was a merge request. Component by component, they just swarmed it. And in one sprint, we swapped over. While you're doing that, you may run into places where it's difficult to write tests without the test bed. And that's probably because you're leaning on Angular possibly too heavily. If it's not easy to test, it probably needs to be rewritten, right? That's a good way to know whether or not your code is in keeping with solid. Because if it is solid code, single responsibility, open, close, etc., it's going to be easy to test. Because all the things that make it solid make it easy to test. And lastly, my team is largely filled with junior developers, and a lot of them would get hung up on tests that they couldn't get to pass, right? They stripped the test bed out. They couldn't figure out how to rewire things. They weren't thinking about what the test bed was doing for them automatically. They didn't think about what lifecycle hooks they now had to call manually. All right, I now have to manually call component.ng on init. I can't rely on fixture detect changes to do that for me. Don't worry about it. Just disable them, revisit them later. And if they do need to go back into the test bed, that's cool. It happens. Sometimes they're just way too convoluted, especially if there's too many moving parts. So when we do that with our app, we get this for our code coverage report, which looks wildly different, right? We've dropped about 24%. We've lost a quarter of our coverage. Does anybody spot a problem with this? It's right there. We've still got 100% coverage with just a constructor test. So getting rid of the Angular testbed is not the only answer. It's just part of it. But still, that's a pretty impressive drop simply by dropping the testbed. If you're interested in this, at the end, I have a link to the code. There are multiple branches. You can check them out. You can run these tests yourself. Okay. So step number 2, ignore the report. To be specific, ignore the green. Because ultimately it's lies. Just like it's turtles all the way down, it's lies all the way down. So don't trust the green. Don't take what the system gives you for free. Treat your components and functions like black boxes, and treat the component like it's one thing. Right? We still want to use behavior-driven testing. We don't want to actually write a test that focuses on that one line of code, because as soon as that one line of code needs to be changed, it's a pain. It shouldn't matter what internal mechanisms achieve the task as long as the task itself is covered. So treat your functions, treat your components like black boxes. Now, what the reports are good for, trust the red. Anytime you see red on the reports that this has not been run, that's gold. Instantly, I know that whole function needs to be covered. Awesome. That's beautiful. That tells me good things. The conditionals, when you look at the branch coverage, right, we're looking at things like here, branches. 10% of my branches are covered when I only use constructors. I've got a whole lot of branches to figure out. But here, the conditionals, you're probably going to get default paths for free, right? If my constructor takes in things, maybe I have defaults for functions so that I can overload them effectively. I'm going to get one of those branches for free. So yeah, OK confidence in the conditionals. But any conditionals that the report does call out, you don't have this if, you don't have this else, you're missing this end of the switch. Those are gold. And that often tells you that this function isn't actually covered. It's just been called somewhere else, and 1 or 2 paths have been covered by a test somewhere else. But if there are pieces missing, then let's just go through and write a test for all of those branches anyway. Because what happens if the function that calls that helper function stops calling that helper function? Now I've got a spontaneous drop in my code coverage all of a sudden. How am I going to explain that to the client? What did you do? Delete tests? So the coverage report is useful for a lot, but the green isn't trustworthy. OK, so our new set of tests to get 100% coverage grow from what they were before with as much code here as is here. It's almost the same amount of code actually achieves 100% coverage. I'm checking that the title is here and what the string is set to. I'm checking that the edit conspiracy subject exists and it is in fact a subject. We're checking that the logged in is part of the auth service. We're checking that logout gets called as soon as the constructor runs, because it's my home component. I want to make sure the user starts when they're logged out, right? So if I ditch the testbed and write tests for all of my stuff except for one file, I ignored a file on purpose, I can achieve 100% coverage on everything in about 40 tests. It's not bad. It took me maybe an hour and a half to write all these. Again, I don't have to deal with fixture detect changes. I don't have to deal with async awaits. I don't have to deal with a whole lot. And this application is not terribly complex, but. All right, so takeaways. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. It's not a good presentation if you don't have a random quote from a random guy. So this is my random quote from a random guy. Stats are down here if you're looking for it specifically. But ultimately, this is the spirit of what I'm getting at, right? This is a problem if you care enough, and you should, because this is your code coverage. These tests do a lot for you. If you have to do a refactor of your code, these tests will cover your functionality and make sure you don't go backwards, right? They are what hold you accountable on those kind of efforts. And not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that counts matters. Contracts rely on code coverage because that's representative of their expectation of you to write quality code, right? So take that one step further. Don't just go for the shortest win path to get your code coverage, because as we can see, that's pretty easy if you go with really bad coding practices, right? I had my edit and my delete buttons swapped. I did that on purpose. Yet I had 100% code coverage or 88% code coverage, right? That is contract passing in most places. Doesn't actually test anything. Our fix is to drop the test bed for anything at the unit levels and ignore the report. Do the work yourself. Or find a different way to log your code coverage. I specifically didn't want to go looking for other packages that could do that for you because I don't want to sell you on something that I don't have confidence in. But by and large, if you ignore the report and simply use your code as your guideline, I'm going to write this function, I'm going to make a describe on that function, then I'm going to do a whole bunch of it shoulds. It should do this, it should do this, it should do this. Then at the end of going through all of that, you get rewarded with 100% coverage, and that should feel good. And you don't have to ever touch that component ever again, which is fantastic. And it covers you on things like this. I still have 80% coverage, and I've got one component with 0 branches and less than 50% across the board, right? So if I'm developing here, I'm not going to really have problems with my pipeline if my pipeline is set to, like, say, 75 instead of 85, right? It buys you time to get this functionally working and then sweep through and test it and refactor, et cetera. But this is to say the testbed isn't bad, right? It's still useful for integration tests. It's useful for large application tests. You're not going to use it when you use protractor or end-to-end tests, but for anything that's cross-component, you want to test specific rendering. If you have to do some sort of review page where you're displaying a whole lot of data and it needs to have 508 compliance or ARIA labels or anything like that, the only way to hook into the HTML that's running is through the testbed. So you're still going to use the testbed. Here's one good side benefit: speed. I'm a big fan of Top Gear and the Grand Tour. So at the beginning, we had 6 tests using the testbed, and it ran at about half a second. Gave me about 88% coverage. My rewrite has 40 tests. Now, I skipped one component, so it's probably going to have closer to 60 by the time it's done. But it runs in 1/10 of the time. And as you saw, it's got 100% coverage on the components I wrote tests for, right? This has endless lies. This has very few lies, and it runs at 1/10 the speed. To make this even more impressive, my current project, several months ago, we had 900 tests. We were breaking them apart across 2 different browsers. So we were sharding the work across 2 browsers in order to run tests twice as fast. Combined, we ran about 900 tests in about 5 minutes. As of yesterday, we broke the 1,700 test barrier, and we're still under 2.5 minutes. And that includes our integration tests. That is not just unit tests. That's every single test on our front end, minus end-to-end. Our end-to-end tests take hours to run because obviously you're running the entire application and doing a whole lot. But so if we take and we consider a 2.5 minute gain, right? That's not all that big, right? That's a cup of coffee. But times a team of developers of 20, now we're at 40 minutes, 60 minutes, that's an hour. And I don't know about you, but how many times a day do you push code up into your pipeline? How many times a day do you run the test suite to see what you might have broken while you're developing a new feature, right? So this is potentially hours of development time saved by investing a sprint or 2 in making a shift. So, not too bad for 18 minutes. So hopefully this didn't put you to sleep. If you've got questions, please ask. I also have an entire component's worth of tests I did not write in order to write tests for you if you would like to see what tests look like not in the testbed. And here's all the information. The PowerPoint is here, and the code can be found here. There are branches for the 6 baseline tests. There is a branch for stripping out the testbed and running those same 6 that gave me that much lower, 25% lower code coverage report. And then there is the 3rd branch that has the unit tests for almost all of the files. So Yeah.
You made the point early on that the Angular framework creates the test that creates a component.
Mm-hmm.
Why bother if that can't work? Something else is drastically wrong. Do you have any other absolutes like that? And what I find with, and I study this as an application, so when I start looking at testing, I say, well, I don't care about it. What should I really care about? I don't want to check the 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
So there's a whole bunch of absolutes that I don't think I should be testing. And you started talking about branches and stuff like that. That's helpful. Can you give me some guidelines?
Yeah, sure. Let me jump out of the presentation here, and we'll...
Or a source that talks about it.
Sure. Wake up my mouse. All right. So one of the great things about the code coverage report we do get is that we can drill in, right? So if we take a look at this guy and we zoom in, we can see exactly which lines haven't been covered. We don't have any branches here, really, that are throwing up. But if I swap back over to the really, really ugly branch, which is my constructor coverage branch, then when these recompile, we can go dig into some branch type things. As far as absolutes, I think the best thing I've got for you in that regard, especially if you don't want to really deal with the nitty gritty, like I don't want to bother testing every individual line of code, it goes back to Jasmine being a behavioral driven thing. It's just fine with testing end-to-end things, right? You treat all of your components and functions like black boxes, right? You stimulate it in some way. You call the function with some sort of input, or you create the component and you throw a object into an observable, and then you see how the function reacts or the component reacts. You don't have to test the 15 lines of code that cause that reaction. You simply have to say, if I do A, I expect B. And that's good enough. Because ultimately the inner working mechanism should be allowed to change if they need to, right? I might take that observable chain that does something interesting, like loads up my form when I click the edit button. I might want that to also do something else. Right? Maybe I want to load that something else, load that data somewhere else. So I might take that chain and add a tap to take a snapshot of that data and pass it somewhere else, right? Those tests will still pass because I haven't negatively modified that data chain, for instance. And that will let you test the essential pieces, only the parts that really matter, instead of having to focus on one individual line. If we go back, yeah, here we go. All right, so let's see here. Okay, so this guy's got 50%, so we're going to have a branch somewhere, right? So this yellow right here says that the false part of this ternary hasn't been tested. So I can now figure out, I need a test to somehow stimulate this false part of this branch, which is good, because this ternary here is what keeps me from deleting the wrong conspiracy when I hit delete, right? Because this is my add conspiracy function. I'm creating a new array out of my behavior subject. I'm going to give the conspiracy an ID, because this one function gets used for add and for update. So if I'm updating, the one that I got sent has an ID, then I want to reuse that. If I don't have an ID, because this is a whole new conspiracy, then I want to give it a new ID, and I'm just using my list length +1 to do that. It could be a UUID function or whatever, right? So in this case, I have no tests that cover what happens when I actually add a conspiracy, right? And this function is covered by the constructor because, okay, so I did a whole bunch of work to make that 88%. Hopefully most of this won't happen to you guys because you guys are using better programming practices than that, but I used my add conspiracy function during a load data to load my dummy data, right? So that's how I was able to call this when my constructor goes, right? Ultimately, this might not be called by the constructor. I might call this in a route resolver or something else, right? But in this case, I am adding my little mock conspiracies here by calling add conspiracy over and over again. And another fun thing, because this is testing with only a create test, if I change the order of these, my code coverage will change. Because I have a sort algorithm, and specifically I put these in this order so it exercises both the left and the right-hand side of my sort algorithm. in order to up my fake code coverage. So it's another indicator of the fact that you don't have the right amount of tests. If you change something that has no consequence at the end and your code coverage changes because of it, that's a problem. I'm not entirely sure that that answers your question.
It's in part way.
Okay, all right.
It's a very broad question, I understand.
Yeah. Other absolutes. I love the CLI. I really do. I love it all. I use it all the time. If you're not a fan of writing on the command line, I highly suggest the Angular console. It's a little Electron app. We'll see if I can get it pulled up here. Basically, what Narwhal did is they took the Angular CLI and all those schematics and they built a little user interface for it. So what I can do is I can open my workspace here. Let me see here. No, it's in code repositories, Excel, Angular DC. All right, so I can point it at this Angular repo, hit open. And now I have access to running the application if I want to. Or over here, there's a generate component button, and I can do that. I can also click on the generate code tab, and I can generate anything in here. And the best part about this is it exposes all of the command line switches that you normally would have to remember. Like, do I want an inline style or an inline template, or do I care about using CSS or SCSS or Sass or whatever, right? This exposes all of the command line elements in here. So you can do things in a flat way, you can do a skip test, you can have it be automatically imported into a different module. All the things the CLI does for you that as of Angular 7 now have prompts, this guy puts in a UI. I used this to build the sample app entirely. This is a fantastic tool. Use it every day, especially if you're doing components, because this will folderize it for you, this will wire everything up, this will automatically update your module. The CLI is fantastic. I just don't like that it dumps you in the testbed every time. So at some point I might build a schematic to, why are we installing? I must have grabbed the installer instead of something else. But yeah, welcome to the Angular console.
That was the first
Cool.
question, so if you want to get
Yes, you get a book.
Oh,
Whether you like it or not, you get a book.
thank you.
Any other questions? I can do some live coding. I can dance for you. I've got another 20 minutes to entertain you.
I think you touched on. I was going to ask what the branches mean, but I think you answered. It's all the code paths.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, let's see. So yellow will highlight a code part of a branch that hasn't been happened. If I were to add something like conspiracy equals false here, actually I can do that real quick. So if I go back to my login, or is that the home component? Which one are we looking at there? We're looking at the conspiracy service is what we're looking at. All right, so if I grab my services folder and grab my conspiracy service, and let's say we make this have a default value of, maybe we don't want a new conspiracy. We probably just want null. All right, so I've got a default value of null now. If I save that, I'm going to rerun my code coverage report. All right, test still pass, cool. And now I have an I right here, right? So that says the if branch hasn't been taken. If I were to only test it with, if I were to take it with, I believe, no object, right? Because I'm running it in my load data function, which always has an object. If I were to call this function without an object, like in a test or something, and do that only, instead of the I, it would have an E for the else branch, right? So when we're looking at our code coverage statistics, that is this guy here, our branches. It's telling us you have this many logical branches, you've covered half of them. So you should go find the other ones. And odds are pretty good if you have one missing branch, you're probably only testing the other by happenstance. In this case, obviously, my constructor test is calling load data, which is calling my add conspiracy. So the else is being taken for granted, so I should probably write a test for both, because odds are pretty good when I go hooking this up to an actual backend, this load data function is going to disappear, my mock data is going to disappear, and now I'm going to have 0 tests for this. I'm going to have a drop in code coverage, which, if it's the last test that breaks the camel's back, could cause your pipe to break, right? If your pipe has a code coverage enforcement step in it, you could all of a sudden not be able to get this emergency bug out because you're so low on code coverage, you just can't. Now I've got to go find tests to fix. It's a pain. We actually had that happen. We had a whole mess of date math functions that just, right when we switched from one year to the other, a whole bunch of tests had been written that were not current date agnostic. They used absolute dates, and they were like date comparisons, right? So when we crossed over years, a whole bunch of our year validation functions broke all of a sudden, because now it's not 4 years when it's 2014 versus 2019, it's 5 years. So the quick fix to get things through was just to disable all of them. We'll fix them later. Well, that doesn't run your tests, so now your code coverage drops, and all of a sudden the pipe stops working. So yeah, date math is hard. It sucks. If you haven't looked at these numbers on the side, tells you how many times that line of code was run. So here we see 9 times. There's a set of 3 for this test, and then the conspiracy service is pulled into probably 2 other components, because I don't have any mocks right now. So it's going to get loaded up 2 other times. So that's my 9. And then I have 3 items, so 9 times 3 is 27. When it does this filter, it's trying to filter out any conspirators that are empty. That's how I delete a conspirator in this. I just delete the line. So if I log in, and I edit with the delete button, which is fun. If I do that, and then I update, well, now it's an add, because my code coverage is 88%. And this kind of stuff happens. So, other questions?
The report itself that you were showing, is that the Karma test runners report?
Yeah, so this right here, this is the Karma coverage report. You can find it in your code here in the coverage folder. You just open up this index.html in a browser, and it dynamically loads all of your stuff. So your stock standard Angular project will do this for you. The script I'm running to run tests is here. It's just ng test -- code coverage. And then normally I have watch equals false, because you only want to run it once. Like, I only need code coverage once. I don't need it running over and over again. But you can overload that here, as you can see. You can override or add your own flags by having a -- and then any additional flags you want to pass through. This -- breaks the flags through the npm wrapper and then applies them to the ng command, because I actually want to pass this to the ng command. It's not a flag for npm, it's a flag for ng. So that's how you can, I can override the false with a true, and it's going to take whatever the last setting is. So that's how I have my code coverage running continuously here in the corner. Fairly often, this is how I'll develop tests. I'll just have code coverage running in the corner. I'll just write tests every time I save. It's going to run them again. I might put an F on, do an F-describe on the one file I'm working on, so that I just run the one file. It's also a good way to make sure I'm doing something isolated. If this service gets used elsewhere, or it's a helper class or anything like that, you might get artifacts of extra coverage because it's used somewhere else. But that's another one of the problems with Jasmine Karma, is that it still compiles every test. It just doesn't run the ones. So like, if I disable all 6 create tests, so not a single one of them runs, I still have something like 20 or 30% code coverage, because just compiling the stuff counts as running some code. So there's just no way to get around, give me the exact lines that are run. You just can't trust it. So, so you had a question earlier about how to not have to deal with tests, finding test error data in your giant log of Karma stuff, right? This one, the answer I have for that is actually a package. If I flip back over to my conspiracy exposed, oh, I've got a file that changed. What did I change? Oh, I added my default thing, so let me trash this. Cool. So if I run to my conspiracy exposed branch, which has my big batch of 40 tests, as you can see, it's running in 0.06 seconds. So notably faster than 0.4 seconds, orders of magnitude less. Let's go find a test to break. Let's go to my conspiracy folder, my list. This is the biggest component I've got that actually has tests in it. Let's see here. So here are my tests around sorting, right? So I have a little sort because I want to sort by title. I don't want to sort by ID. I want my conspiracies alphabetized by title because that's how I'm displaying them. So my my function for sorting is pulled right off of Google. I'm lame like that. I firmly believe that writing sorting algorithms is strictly an interview job. Let's see here. So I have a batch of tests, right? I should return 1 when items are in order, should return 1 when items are out of order, should return 0 when the items are the same, and then I want it to be null safe, so I have a test for null safety. And that gives me 100% coverage on this guy. So if, for instance, I get rid of my null safety here, and I simply have constant x equals a dot title to lowercase. So now I'll rerun tests. One of those should break. Yeah. So what I have running here is it's a package called Karma Spec Reporter. And what it does is it still logs the breaks up here in the log, which are big and ugly and hard to find. But what it also does is it puts a summary of them at the bottom. So it consolidates all my failed tests at the bottom. You can configure how many lines of the stack trace you want. I have it set to 5. That's usually enough. You could trim it down. And it also numbers them here, which is pretty nicely. Great question. So this is all done in package JSON. So the one we're talking about here is Karma Spec Reporter. It's this guy. And then the configuration is in Karma. You require it so that it gets pulled in by Karma. You add it as a reporter, spec reporter. And then you can pull this block of options right off of their, I think it's either their GitHub or their npm.js page has this block of options. And then you just set them to whatever you want. I'm using the default max log lines of 5. I turn off this, I don't know, they named these backwards. So true means don't show it, because they chose to go with suppress for whatever reason. So I am unsuppressing error summary, so I get that summary at the end. I am suppressing skipped tests, because I don't want to see stuff that I've disabled and skipped. Everything else, I am showing spec timing. That's one that's not inverted. And I have turned fail fast off. I want it to run all of my tests, not stop at the first one that fails. Because I'd rather look at like 3 or 4 tests and say, oh, I can fix all those, go fix those 3 or 4, and then come back instead of having to do it one by one by one by one by one. So that just runs here in the Karma, and then once you've imported the package and added this, you just run it. It's gold. It's great. I'm still running tests here because I didn't bother to configure up Chrome headless or anything else like that. Most of my work happens in a VM, so I have Chrome headless there, so I don't have to deal with nasty changes to video over a remote connection, etc. But this is great. The problem here is if you have anything that causes a console log, so there are console log warnings that can happen, right? If you have a combine latest or a merge where it's taking multiple observables and combining them in some way, if one of those is undefined, because it was maybe an add input that somebody added and then didn't go through and update all of the tests to have that input configured to be something, even if it's just observable true or whatever, you'll get a warning that will not break your tests that says that there is a expected, where there was supposed to be a stream, I got an undefined. And that will explode your log it won't show up unless you pull open the developer console here. So that's often why I like having my work done in the terminal, because I'll see that. It'll flash big white and blue as the different reporters see that, and then I instantly know, aha, one of my folks didn't check everything. Is often what's happened, but it's of course never my error. I don't make any errors. That doesn't happen. No, never. No. So yeah, that's the one testing package that I really do endorse heavily. It's really nice. Shows you great things like this. And this is where you can see the naming conventions in tests. All of our test files start with a describe, right? You describe the component. Describe can be used inside to group things, which is great for code folding. It's also great for turning on an entire group of them or disabling an entire group of them, right? I can xdescribe and skip that whole suite of stuff. Maybe that function is going to get rewritten. Or if I just want to focus in on one function, just show me these 5 or 6 tests, because maybe I'm refactoring that whole piece. I can pull in an F instead, and it'll run only that suite of stuff. So describe is great. And then you get really nice looking results here, right? This is the name of my test. Here's the list of describes that point to it. Now I know where to find it. I know exactly which function it is. I know what the test is, and I don't have to bother with writing a massive long test name that I can't read because it's off the screen. And it still works pretty nicely here, right? I describe sort by title as a function. It should return -1 when items are in order. So Jasmine's pretty great when it comes to that. They did a really good job with figuring out how to name that stuff so it reads off the tongue pretty nicely. So I got 7 minutes. Any more questions? You don't want to see me dance.
So earlier you were saying that when you pull out the Angular Testbed, you want to mock out your third-party dependencies just so it's isolated to the unit test.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations on A, where to keep those mocks in your code base, and
Sure.
B, when in the development process you'd recommend actually creating mocks?
So a lot of times I would create the mock right when I make the service, because oftentimes those third-party things are going to be services. So I'll speak to those. So here I've got a conspiracy service on the side. I've got a spec file. I've got the TS file. The convention that we use that works for us is to make a new file, conspiracy.service.fake.ts. So now I know it's the fake one. And then in here I can start export class mock conspiracy service extends conspiracy service. And then once you fix your import, you can pretty much just go to town with that. You have to extend in order for the typing to work out, because like your constructor wants a conspiracy service. So you have to be a conspiracy service or a subclass. So the extend is important. Alternatively, you can use interfaces, which I personally feel is better, because then I can have my real service implement an interface. I can have my mock implement the interface. And any other service could also implement the interface. Now they're all interchangeable. Because the danger with extends when it comes to services is, let's say conspiracy service is making HTTP calls, right? It's touching a backend somewhere. I've now extended it with my mock. If I don't bring in the constructor and specifically call super with null so that I nullify my dependency injected HTTP client module that is going to be in my service, all of a sudden my unit test is making real HTTP calls, because the testbed doesn't know any better. It's going to pull in whatever module you tell it to. So if you don't remember to do this, all of a sudden you've got craziness with your mocks. So I heavily prefer an interface, because then it solves that problem, and it also forces you to think. It's kind of goes with red-green refactor, right? The TDD approach, right? I need to add a new function to my service. I go to the interface, I add it, I save my file. All of a sudden, my real service and my mock are now broken, right? They do not implement that function. So now I'm red. I go add those functions, I'm green. I write my tests around that function, and I'm done, right? It forces the path, keeps everything clean. So we use fake.ts for any kind of mock kind of thing. You could use mock.ts, it's entirely up to you. The weird thing is, and if I get rid of this, it's gonna complain. It's gonna complain because it's not, whatever. Just be happy. We're happy? Okay, cool. The downside is if I go back to my code coverage report and I go back to my service here, because I'm not using this somewhere, let me pull this in here. So in my conspiracy, so now let's say I can pull this in here, right? So instead of new mock service, it's going to be mock conspiracy service, right? So I'll import that instead. I leave my type as the regular service because that's what I actually care about. It should be that type. My mock is simply an extension or an alternate implementation of that same stuff. Now, when these tests get run, and hopefully this won't make me a liar. Yeah, so now my fake shows up as something I have to care about with code coverage. Luckily enough, it's going to get used in a lot of tests, so I shouldn't have to worry about it. But if for whatever reason you go throwing a whole bunch of stuff into the fake that doesn't actually get used by anything, this could count against you. This is also a way that the whole system can pad the total, right? So now I'm up to 77% code coverage because I've gone from 108 lines of code to 109, and I've gone from 84 to whatever. So the 25 lines I'm down is now 25 divided by 109 instead of 25 divided by 108. I've gone up a percentage or two by adding a fake. It's another way that these numbers don't actually mean anything. Does that answer your question on Fox? Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And there may be third-party things that you just have to use the testbed for, right? But most of the third-party stuff you might be using, like a web component library, PrimeNG, Angular Material, et cetera, if you're touching those at the class level, maybe with a view child or something else like that, those are still Angular things. They are still built on basic object-oriented JavaScript, so they will have classes. You should be able to call their constructor. You should be able to simply say, that view child that's a public property is a new PrimeNG autocomplete, right? So that you can simply say, here's a fake one to play with. All I really care about is that when I do something, it calls this function on that PrimeNG third-party thing, right? I'm not here to test PrimeNG's product. I'm not here to test Angular's product. I'm here to test my code. So I might wrap that service in a property so that I can spy on that autocomplete and spy on the take focus function, right? I want to make sure that this thing that my component does will tell the autocomplete to yank the user's focus there. Then I can simply check that when I stimulate the component in the right way, it calls the function, the spy gets activated. Cool, my component's job was done. It's up to that other thing to solve that problem, right? It can be too easy with testing to stray outside of the scope of whatever you're working on. So draw those lines with a sharp, big fat marker. So, all right, 7:30.
If you're starting new on a project,
Mm-hmm.
would you recommend going with Jasmine, or would you prefer like Jest or something?
I don't have any experience with Jest. Some of these other guys might. I'm very interested in trying it out. I have no idea if it has these same symptoms or not, so I can't speak to it, but give it a try. See what happens. If it uses the testbed, it's probably going to have similar problems. It may have a different code coverage utility that may be or may not be as susceptible to just counting things for free. I'm not sure. Does Jest use Karma?
Yeah, I haven't used it, but I've seen some articles where people don't go with Jasmine, but they're recommending to switch it to Jest
Sure.
after you create the project.
Yeah, I think you could certainly give it a try. I have no experience to base an opinion off of, so I can't help you with that. But I think it'd be awesome if something like the Angular CLI had a switch for, do you want your tests in Jasmine or Jest? And maybe you configure that when you do the Angular CLI create application. But that's a thing you can do. Let me pick one of those two, right? Because these are pretty well fleshed out testing frameworks at this point, right? They're pretty darn reliable. So obviously the Angular team had a reason for picking Jasmine and Karma. They're pretty much the most widely used ones. But open a bug report against the Angular code base. Make them think about it. Maybe they'll do it for us. I mean, they're making a lot of changes to the CLI right now. They added prompts. They're going to add even more interactability to the CLI. They might be open to supporting alternates like that. Or maybe you can write your own schematic, right? There was a schematic writing talk last month. The video's on the Angular DC YouTube. Check that out. Maybe write your own schematic. Pulls in your own stuff instead. I might make some modifications to these default ones so that it makes 2 test files instead. Give me a spec file that has no test bed. Give me an integration.spec.ts that has the test bed. And you can modify your Angular JSON file, Karma, TS config files, and all of that to run just your integration files or just your unit files. When we made our switch, my team, we've got a couple hundred components. Like I said, we're at 1,700 tests. That tells you the size of our application. We did that. We split anything using the test bed or above is in an integration.spec.ts. Only things that don't use the test bed go in a regular spec, and we have run test unit, run test integration to run just one suite or the other, and then run test runs both of them as one batch for complete comprehensive code coverage. You can find articles on how to do that online. It's not difficult. It's just some configuration and then writing a couple more scripts in package.json. So it's pretty handy.
You talked about running like 900 tests split between 2 browsers.
Mm-hmm.
What was that about?
Yeah, so that's this guy. So there is a package you can pull in called Karma Parallel. It will take your tests and shard them across multiple browsers. There's a couple different sharding schemes as far as picking, is it round robin, is it by size, by length, or whatever. The problem we ran into was that we could only run at 2. The module supposedly supports up to 4 browsers. The problem is when you spool up an instance of Chrome, it often consumes 100% CPU capability. So when you're spooling up 4 of them, you're consuming 400% CPU, and the system can have problems. We had sometimes those instances of Chrome would drop, they would disconnect, and you lose that whole half of your tests. You have to start over again. We found 2 browsers to run and work pretty consistently, but when we shifted our deployment pipeline from one environment to another, the new one had much less, far fewer resources from CPU and RAM standpoint, so we had to strip back down to just 1. But at this point, it's running as quickly as it was before when we had this across 2 browsers. So it's very little of a net change for us, but as you can see, we're running almost twice the number of tests in that time. So when it's running that fast, you almost don't need 2 browsers because it's pretty quick. It depends on how large your application is. But the downside is if any one of those browsers disconnects, you lose the whole run because it doesn't recover. You have to crash the process and boot it up again, and then you're waiting another possibly 4 or 5 minutes to get it back up again. So we ended up dropping that package, but it is a thing you can do. I believe Karma supports running tests across multiple browsers at once if they're different browsers. Like if you want to run all of your tests against IE, Chrome, and Firefox at once, I believe Karma will do that for you. It'll spool up all of them and run the tests in all of them simultaneously, or maybe it does them sequentially. We haven't experimented with that because our VMs are Linux, so we really only test manually on Firefox and IE. But
so these are only in the pipeline. In your local dev machine, what would you run? Is it only the unit tests?
No, we run both in our local dev. We just use Chrome headless.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's Chrome or Chromium, and then you pass in the headless flag, so it doesn't spool up the actual physical browser. It just runs them in the background, and that's faster for us because we don't have to bother with it popping up. And our VMs are over a remote desktop connection, so anything we can do to reduce things that change on the screen and eat up bandwidth, the better. So we just prefer to have the console. Although several of my coworkers specifically run it in Chrome with the browser up because they want to see a graphical representation for them because that's what's best for them. So yeah.
For those, it would be better if you had the console like you were showing before.
Well, that's the nice thing. If you run the reporters are a different configuration than the browser is. So if we go back to Karma Conf, my reporters here are progress. That's the one that shows you I'm on test 5 of 10 or whatever. The KJ HTML, this is the Karma Jasmine HTML reporter here. That's what gives us those pretty code coverage reports. And then the spec is my terminal output. Those are completely independent of my browser configuration. So you can pick it on whatever you want. The difference is things like the spec reporter, which specifically dump to the console, those show up, and actually we can open them up here. If I expand this and open this and go to the console, and if I refresh this so it reruns my tests, yeah. So looks like it's only throwing the first one. There may be a different configuration. I have seen, let's see here. I know for our application, it actually spits into the console here in the browser the name of every test as it goes through. So we get this huge, massive log in there. But I'm not sure why it's not doing it here.
And you mentioned about having different browsers in there. What would be the driving factor for that? Is it like accessibility related?
Like if I want to run Chrome and IE and it's just to make sure that the JavaScript executes with the different polyfills for each of the browsers, right? IE is going to be way behind the other ones, so you're relying on polyfills to help bridge the gap between whatever JavaScript it can run and you're trying to write in. Same thing with Firefox, right? You're testing that the code that you wrote works okay with those polyfills to help bridge the gap between what you're trying to write in and what the browser will run. That's largely what that's going to be for.
You can just click on debug so you can see all the stuff you can do.
Ah, is that what I'm missing?
Yeah. Just click on debug. There you open the console.
There they are. Thank you.
We'll do that.
I don't use the Karma in the browser very often, so I don't know all those fun tricks. So this here is the spec reporter. The spec reporter specifically logs the name of every test that it runs. We actually pulled that package in on accident, or not on accident, but in order to do a debug, we had a test that was hanging and causing an async timeout, but we had no idea which test it was out of our 9 or 100 or 1,000 tests. So we ended up pulling this in so we could see exactly which was the last test run, and that helped us zero in on which test was, for whatever reason, causing a big problem. So we've left it in since then.
Does your Teams app use authentication?
Not yet. We're spooling up on that now.
About a year ago, I had the back end fine, all tested and everything with it in. And I got to the front end, and after I mocked everything and did everything, I had no idea what I was testing at that point. It just got so complex.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling on when to add authorization, authentication to
Sure.
that. I was always thought early was better,
Yeah.
but now I can't test,
Right.
or I'm struggling to test. So I'm looking for some source to help out on an Auth0 authentication.
Sure. So there's, I'm trying to think of her name. Her last name is Maida, M-A-I-D-A. She does community outreach for Auth0, and she's a huge fan of Angular, and she's an Angular developer. She gives talks at conferences.
Yeah, I think I've seen some of her.
Okay. She might be somebody to reach out to because she obviously knows Angular and Auth0. She might be able to help you to bridge that gap. From a testing standpoint, by and large, your authorization is probably going to be run via a service so that you can access it in multiple components.
Right.
So ultimately, your tests around that service should, for the most part, put that service in a vacuum. If I call this function on the service, does it make this call to my auth API? Right? You're just going to test that the service fires the things it should, and that when it receives certain responses, it sends this, it echoes that in whatever manner you want. Right? If it gets a 200 auth good, cool, it sends back a true or the user object or something like that. Bound your service, get that working, and from there, the rest of your application should be able to hook into the service via those functions.
What was her name again?
Her last name is Maida, M-A-I-D-A. I know that.
That's all I need. 'Cause
yeah.
I looked at some of her videos and she's very good, but
Yeah.
at the time she didn't have anything that
Yeah.
took me to the next level.
So that would be like using a spy for those services?
So you would use a spy for Kim Maida, right here. Yeah, so she's spoken at Angular conferences, and she is a technical content lead for Auth0, so she might have Kim Maida.
Yeah.
You can reach out to her. We can probably find her on Twitter. Yeah, there you go. So you would use the real service to test the service. Obviously, you want to test your real code. You would use the HTTP testing module to mock your API calls. You don't want to make live API calls. And then your service is, again, just a class, right? It has that add injectable at the top, but that doesn't change the fact that it's just a JavaScript class, right? And it has functions, so you should be able to, in your test, probably even without the test bed, well, maybe not without the test bed for services. If you're going to test the API calls, you're going to need the test bed because you're going to have to pull in the testing thing. But if you have other functions, maybe that manage your cache or what else, you basically just put it in a vacuum. Then, for all of your components that pull in that service, you would build a mock service that returns maybe a dummy user object. You might even expose the cache on the mock service so that you can stuff the cache with something or empty it out so you can see how your component reacts when it can't find a user, right? Maybe you have an error path that you show the user a message, I can't log you in, I'm sorry, right? So you might want to spy on the function of the service and have it return a null or an empty object or something so that when your component calls that function, gets the value you put in the spy, you can check, you can expect this other helper function to be called that toasts an error message, right? Then in a separate bunch of tests, you would test that toast, when it gets called, does its thing, right?
I mean, that's what I was getting. It was just, I was getting 3 and 4 mocks and all this other stuff testing to test one line.
Right.
And this is crazy.
Yeah.
When I know Auth0 is going to work, I'm not worried about it.
Right. Yeah.
And I just gave up at that point.
Yeah, it can be tough, especially if things are overly complicated. And ultimately, the only advice I have to lean on for that is going back to one of these slides here. Let test writing inform your refactors. If it's hard to write tests, then it probably could be done simpler. You don't have something that's solid, right? You have too many moving parts. You can't break them apart in order to write your tests. So what that probably means is you have, it sounds like your authorization system is broken across a lot of different pieces, which is maybe intuitive from the standpoint of I'm building it, so I'm iterating over this small piece, this small piece, this small piece. But then the problem comes, how do I test it as a whole? And it's too complicated. So what you might need to do is consolidate some of that. And that might mean your files grow in size. That's OK. If that brings things together and makes things less interconnected and more just self-reliant, then you've got the black box you're trying to test is much smaller. You've got less wires going in and out of it, and that makes it simpler. The S in solid stands for single responsibility, but I think it also stands for simple. Simple is better. And I highly doubt anything you're trying to do is massively groundbreaking. And I don't mean that like an insult, but I mean like 99% of our applications are simple line of business apps, right? They're not doing anything complicated. Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, if it's difficult to test, it might be over-engineered. It might be time to take that whole system, scrap it on a branch, and just play with it for a day. If you rewrite that whole thing from scratch, knowing what you know now that you've experimented with all the different pieces, maybe there's a different design pattern and it's worth taking a day or two and trying it in a different way. And you might find that illuminating.